I think. Yeah, it is 6 o'clock on Wednesday, October 18th, 2023. Man, we've had a couple of really nice fall-like days. And I say fall-like on purpose, because around here it's hard to tell when it's really fall or not. I know that somewhere, probably very close to where my hands are right now, is what I'm looking for. But then I could have just put my Bible down on top of it, couldn't I? Well, maybe not. Okay. I wonder if I ate my telephone. Well, anyway, good evening. I'm hoping this is going out well. I'm just not sure. It seems like our internet has been very spotty today. I think Comcast will be doing some maintenance, and I'm not sure when they will start or if they have started already, because ever since, well, for several days it's been kind of spotty, and I'm also kind of wondering about this audio, since it's looks like it's going crazy here, and that concerns me. I may be so loud you can't bear it. Anyway, I want to just mention a couple things. One is we need to keep remembering stuff in the Middle East. A lot of turmoil there. It's always a place of tension, but as of course now here lately the tension has boiled over into warfare, and so please be praying for that situation, for peace, and ultimately, of course, peace will only come finally when the Lord reigns forever and ever. And also want to mention that, and I know this is the last thing I was looking at on my phone. I got a message from the sister of a friend of mine. Some of you may remember when Jones Creek got the first Mexican restaurant in the building that's currently occupied by Taco Jalisco. It was called Mi Casa, I think, or Mi Cocina. I'm getting old now. I've lost track exactly the name of it, but it was owned by a family, had it. Juan and Michela Hernandez, and I probably mispronounced her name. Really sweet lady. And their son often worked there. Juan Jr. The family called him Junior. I called him Juan. And his wife, Dora. Several years ago they had moved to the Austin area. Liberty Hill, I believe, is where Juan and Dora were living. But I just got word from Keela, Juan's sister, that Juan passed away. And I have no information as to what happened, but she just said that, the family was devastated, and told me where I could find the information about the service, and even though I had not talked to him in person in a while, we've conversed by way of Facebook and kind of kept track of each other that way. And I know a few years ago, he and Dora came by the church one afternoon and surprised me, and just really, really good people. And so pray for Dora and their kids. I'm not sure if they still have one in school. I think they may. And then, of course, pray also for Mom and Dad and Keela and his older brother, Habas. And I don't remember if there's another sibling or not. I think that's all. But anyway, do pray for them. I don't really have any other prayer updates, but I will tell you that Charlie had talked to Jim and Wendy the other day, and they're doing well. Jim is doing as well as possible these days, I guess. But so continue to pray for them. They're looking at maybe moving closer to her work after the first of the year. And I'm looking, and I don't see any other prayer requests or prayer updates that are jumping out at me. But also, just a reminder, we've got Trunk or Treat coming up in a couple of weeks, right out here in the back parking lot. And and if you do have any prayer requests or updates, please, type them into the comments section. Tonight we're going to be in, of course, Exodus chapter 14. I've been wanting to do that for a while. It's not a real long chapter. In fact, to me, it's a very brief chapter concerning everything that takes place in it. Because, this is a very eventful time for Israel. So, Exodus 14, beginning in verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and camp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. You must camp in front of Baal-zephon, facing it by the sea. Pharaoh will say of the Israelites, 'They are wandering around the land in confusion. The wilderness has boxed them in.' I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them. Then I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." So the Israelites did this. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about the people and said, "What have we done? We released Israel from serving us." So he got his chariot ready and took his troops with him, or his people with him. I'll come back to that. He took 600 of the best chariots and all the rest of the chariots of Egypt, with officers in each one. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the Israelites who were going out defiantly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his horsemen and his army, chased after them and caught up with them as they camped by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians coming after them. The Israelites were terrified, and cried out to the Lord for help. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this what we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. But Moses said to the people, don't be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the Lord's salvation that he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you must be quiet. The Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to break camp. As for you, lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. As for me, I am going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh, all his army, and his chariots and horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I receive glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the angel of God, who was going in front of the Israelite forces, moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and stood behind them. It came between the Egyptian and Israelite people. There was cloud and darkness. It lit up the night, and neither group came near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back with a powerful east wind all that night and turned the sea into dry land. So the waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with the waters like a wall to them on their right and their left. The Egyptians set out in pursuit, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen, and went into the sea after them. During the morning watch, the Lord looked down at the Egyptian forces from the pillar of fire and cloud, and threw the Egyptian forces into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve and made them drive with difficulty. Let's get away from Israel, the Egyptians said, because the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back on the Egyptians, on their chariots and horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea returned to its normal depth. While the Egyptians were trying to escape from it, the Lord threw them into the sea. The water came back and covered the chariots and horsemen, plus the entire army of Pharaoh that had gone after them into the sea. Not even one of them survived. But the Israelites had walked through the sea on dry ground, with the waters like a wall to them on their right and their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the power of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and believed in him and in his servant Moses. So it's kind of interesting here. Some of the places mentioned, well, really pretty much all of them are mentioned here. We don't know exactly where they are, but apparently Israel has been moving in a kind of maybe southeast direction, but now God has told them to turn around, perhaps now going north. And he had them go to this one particular place to camp between Migdal and the sea. And again, we don't know exactly where that is. And I don't even want to try to say I'll say Baal Zephon, but I don't want to try to say Pi Hahiroth again. But the sea could have been either the Red Sea or the Mediterranean. I'm going to assume Red Sea seems more likely here. To any outside observer, it would appear that the Israelites were kind of wandering around in the desert, not quite ready to venture into the desert itself, and maybe confused as to where they were, maybe lost and wandering around. And so that was part of what God was doing to maybe embolden the Egyptians. They'll think, well, they're lost and confused. That'll be easy prey. But wherever this place was would be some large open area to have enough space for the Israelites and their herds and flocks away from the populated areas of Egypt. And we also see that back in Egypt, the Pharaoh and the officials, and really the Egyptians as a whole, were beginning to regret their decision. What have we done? We had all these people as our servants, and we let them go. Can you imagine? We just let them go. Got short memories. But on the other hand, they may have made a fundamental error. Well, they did make a fundamental error, but perhaps they were thinking that the God of the Hebrews was like the so-called gods that they served. They did not have a belief in an omnipresent or omniscient or omnipotent God. They assumed there would be times when their gods would be present with them, and other times when their gods may not be present with them. So they may have assumed that maybe now that the immediate goal that the God of Moses had sought had been achieved. They'd been released from slavery, so now perhaps his interest in the Hebrews had waned and they were on their own, and that's why they were wandering around perhaps. And so another factor to remember is that one of the reasons they enslaved them in the first place was because they were so numerous. They were afraid that they might join in with their enemies and join with them against Egypt, and so now they're on the loose, so they could join with their enemies again, and so we could recover them as slaves, perhaps. If not, we could at least wipe them out. So let's go and do our best to reclaim what we had. So meanwhile, another thing to consider possibly is that in all the interactions between Moses and Pharaoh, it was Pharaoh and his advisors. It was never, the army had not been involved at all. So perhaps the feeling was that the army could accomplish what Pharaoh had not been able to do on his own, and that would be to stop the Israelites. And the army of Egypt was nothing to be sneezed at or coughed at, as the case may be, in this allergy time that we all enjoy around here. The idea is that this was not the idea, but the army of Egypt was one of the great fighting forces of its day, one of the most formidable armies, period. The Canaanites feared the Egyptians and saw that their army was able to conquer in a day. So, that was not something to be taken lightly. But Moses understood that God was involved. Pharaoh and his officials had come to this conclusion that would lead to their deaths, or at least the deaths of the army. There's some, I'm not 100% sure about the details of Pharaoh himself. There's some conjecture that he and his officials turned back before the water, perhaps even before the waters parted. But Pharaoh got his own chariot ready, got his people ready. The people there is probably, some would say troops, some would say army, but this is probably his civilian advisors. They're all in this together, I suppose. And 600 of his best chariots. Chariots were probably the most devastating weapon of the day. Of course, a cavalry force, which also seems to be involved here, horsemen, that was also a great weapon against unmounted soldiers. And then keep in mind, even though they're referred to as Israel's forces here, there's no force. They're not an army. They're not trained for war. They have no weapons at this point. That is the Israelites. So 100 of his best chariots plus the rest of their chariots would have been an overwhelming force practically to anyone, but especially even though there may be many, many, many Israelites, it's a very weak as far as a fighting force. We don't know the exact number of chariots involved, but with 600 of the best plus all the rest, probably well over 1,000. So this overwhelming force approaches the Hebrews, and of course the Hebrews are trusting God completely, as would any of us, right? Actually, they are a lot like us. They were terrified, and they're calling out to Moses, and really they're crying out to the Lord. And that part was appropriate, to cry out to God for help. Where else can you go for help in a situation like that? But it's not, oh God, help us. It's more like, oh, to Moses, why did you bring us out here? Were there not enough graves there in Egypt for us? And they seem to be rewriting recent history. And there could have been a few in the days of the plagues, when Moses went to Pharaoh, and then he would give permission and then renege and not let the people go. There may have been a few of the Israelites, and certainly if you watch the classic movie The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, there was at least one or two who would come to the Moses character in the movie and express concern, but that was certainly not found in Scripture, and certainly was not the prevailing thought of the day. But they're crying out, "Isn't this what we told you? Leave us alone. Let us stay here in slavery. It would have been better for us to stay in slavery." Hey, Judy, I'm glad you're here. Late is good. So the sight of hundreds of Egyptian chariots probably made them forget a little bit about what God had done and what he had said during all this time. But Moses stands in sharp contrast to the rest of the people. He continues to not be afraid. He says, all you have to do is stand still and you will see the deliverance of the Lord. Of course, he doesn't quite understand that they're not going to stand still. They're going to have to move. But he said, the Egyptians you see today, you will not see them ever again. Unlike the rest of the Israelites, he understood that this was part of God's plan. Some have said this might have been Moses' finest hour, when in the face of an overwhelming enemy, backed up against the sea, and a mass of people who were losing hope, he stood strong. While everyone else was in panic mode, he stood firm and faithful, trusting in God's deliverance in spite of these seemingly overwhelming odds and a helpless situation. In verse 15, God says to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me?" And it wasn't so much that the people were crying out to God through Moses, and so then now he basically tells Moses, "Tell the people to get a move on." It's interesting to see, when you look at this from the surface, from what the Egyptians were probably seeing. Here they are, they're easy pickings, they've got no place to go. They can't outrun us, they can't fight us. The only place they can go is into the sea, and that's just to death. They don't understand what's going on, because this was exactly what God wanted them to do. He told Moses, so stretch out your hand, and we should, that kind of implies stretching out the staff again. And so he would part the sea so the Israelites could break camp and cross on dry land. It's interesting to think about this. We don't usually think about this, but when God tells them to move into the sea, it means they're going to have to break camp, gather up the flocks and herds, and move this massive amount of people into the sea. Uh, and surely there wasn't time for that. That would take hours. Except again, God has a plan. His presence, signified by the pillar of cloud and fire, moves, and no longer is it in front of the Israelites. Now it's behind them, between the Israelites and the Egyptians. And if you notice the text, it says often, well, I don't know if it says often or not. It says the pillar of cloud. But then in verse 20 it says, it came between the Egyptian and Israelite forces. There was cloud and darkness. It lit up the night, and neither group could see the other. So that, to me, seems to imply the cloud was darkening the Egyptians' view, and they couldn't see anything at all. But it lit up the night with the fire, so that Hebrews were able to see, to move into the water, to begin to finish breaking camp and move. So it protected and shielded the Israelites, but also gave them light to be able to see. They couldn't see each other, so that enabled the Israelites to break camp and then move into the water. And once Moses raises his hand, the waters part, the east wind comes and blows, and usually the east wind is a hot, dry wind, and so that could have been the way God chose to do this, to accomplish two things: to create this wall of water on one side and a wall of water on the other side, as well as to dry out the land so they could walk across on dry land. And it says they walked between, there was a corridor of dry land with this wall of water on either side between them. And anytime it uses this particular word in Hebrew to talk about a wall, it's not it ain't no fence. It is a huge wall. So we see the Hebrews are crossing on dry land, and we might wonder, why in the world would the Egyptians choose to go after them? Because chariots don't do well in wet ground. And we might be thinking, well, normally it would be wet around there, but now it's dry. They probably see this dry corridor that the Israelites have crossed over, so they think, well, it must be dry enough for us to go, and surely if the Hebrews did it, we can do it. Not to mention God has hardened their hearts. It would seem, when he says God hardened the hearts of the Egyptians, it seems like that's more than just Pharaoh. In fact, there are some who would say that when the confusion, when the cloud came up, Pharaoh and his officials might have turned back. The text does not say that here, okay? So, just a suggestion. So, for whatever reason, they entered. Even before the waters came back, God sent confusion on them. Some of the chariots